Before I begin, I'd like to extend a few thank yous. First to the NSDA for hosting this tournament, which I think is amazing. It offers an opportunity for traditional debaters like me to show what we do on the national stage. I also want to thank my school's administration for their undying support for our speech and debate program, specifically Dr. Daughtry and Mr. Gallagher. Without your support, I wouldn't be where I am today. I'm also deeply indebted to my family, my mom and dad, for driving me to tournaments every Saturday morning, and my brother and sister for showing me what I can do if I work hard in speech and debate. I also couldn't be where I am today without my teammates from my school, Nick, Savin, Zach, Sukum, Nate, everyone, and also my indirect team, my fellow Ohio national qualifiers, who effectively became my team for this tournament. I'd also like to thank my coaches, and I'm most indebted to them, Matt, Mr. Paik, and Mr. Lewis. You guys saw me at my worst at states in octafinals. You saw me at my worst at national qualifiers when I finished as second alternate, and I'm really glad that you guys are here to see me at my best. So with that, let's begin. If you're not ready to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary. Because I agree with Malcolm X that freedom requires a fight, and because this fight realistically requires violence, I affirm, resolved, violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. Because all humans share an intrinsic worth that entitles them to certain dues from their government, my value is justice, defined as giving each their due. The value criterion is mitigating structural oppression for 3 reasons. First, excluding voices allows the ideologies of the privileged to be deemed as universal and true. Only when everyone has a say in the government can the government be just. Second, structural oppression creates skewed, unjust power disparities in both citizen-citizen relationships and citizen-government relationships. This grossly unbalanced power dynamic leaves innocents' fates at the whims of oppressors, allowing oppressors to treat them as subhuman and remove their dignity. Third, because only my criterion can address real-world issues. Absolutist conceptions of justice fail to apply to real-world conditions. Lane 2009 explains, the search for perfect justice is regressive because societies will never agree on a perfect set of rules and institutions. This search distracts us from tackling real-life injustices. The perfect becomes the enemy of the good. The competing vision of justice is a comparative one, which examines the kind of lives people actually can lead. For clarity, I offer one observation. The resolution does not force the affirmative to defend the use of violence in every instance of political oppression, or even in the majority of cases. The affirmative must only prove that violent revolution is a just tool in the toolbox. Contention 1. In the face of oppression, people retain the right to harm their oppressors. This right flows from our innate right to self-defense, as Locke explains. Whosoever uses force without right puts himself into a state of war with those against whom he uses it. In that state, all former ties are canceled, all other rights cease, and everyone has a right to defend himself to resist the aggressor. Contention 2. Alternatives to violence are ineffective at mitigating structural oppression. This is for 4 reasons. First, nonviolence isn't effective anymore because regimes are becoming increasingly savvy at dealing with the techniques of nonviolent protests. Erica Chenoweth finds in a 2017 study that from 2010 through May 2016, the success rates of nonviolent campaigns have significantly declined. New authoritarian techniques designed to undermine and thwart nonviolent activists are to blame. One of these adaptations is counter-protests. Hellmeyer 19, a study of movements under oppressive regimes, found that governments often create fake pro-government rallies during episodes of large domestic and regional opposition. These concurrent rallies deter participation in the anti-government movements because those anti-government movements are falsely seen as not credible and irrepresentative. Second, the rise of the internet is leading to detrimental failures in nonviolent revolutions. According to Name of the Atlantic in 2014, quote, before the internet, the tedious work of organizing that was required to form a protest also helped build infrastructure for decision-making and strategies. Now, movements can rush past that step to their own detriment. Third, nonviolence is counterproductive, since it only forces the government to make cosmetic changes. Gelderloos explains in 2013, quote, if we look at all the major rebellions of the last 2 decades, nonviolence can only affect cosmetic change of the government because nonviolent resistance has never been able to resist the full force of the state. Take, for instance, Sudan, which proves that a nonviolent protest can't create necessary change. In Sudan, the people have nonviolently demanded substantive democratic reforms from the government. However, the government has only made cosmetic changes with the underlying oppressive, corrupt institutions remaining. Fourth, when nonviolence has worked, it was only because of the threat of violence. The fear of violence is what has brought governments to the negotiating table with moderate nonviolent movements. Leon 15, in an empirical study utilizing data from 100 years, concluded that the threat of violence has been the common denominator among successful revolutions. Contention 3, violence is effective at mitigating structural oppression. This is for 3 reasons. First, violence is the only possible response to severe oppression. In cases where the oppressor is unwilling to listen to the demands of the oppressed, violence becomes a necessary tool in the toolbox, as nonviolence is dependent upon the oppressor's willingness to recognize the rights of the oppressed. Simply put, nonviolence requires the unwilling oppressor to grant the oppressed rights, whereas violence enables the oppressor to secure rights for themselves. Second, violence unifies the oppressed, allowing them to overcome historic rivalries. Sue Ann Foster explains in 2005, quote, revolutionary violence, quote, unifies the people by blurring ethnic differences. The armed struggle brings tribal warfare, a legacy of colonialism, to a halt by throwing people in one way and one direction. Third, guerrilla warfare is a powerful tool in overthrowing governments. Guerrilla warfare has allowed violent rebel groups to overcome the government's power advantage and strike strategically at the heart of regimes' interests. Joseph Kramer of the Northeastern Political Science Association writes in 1971, quote, counter-guerrilla warfare is extremely expensive, while guerrilla warfare is extremely inexpensive. The ratio of government soldiers required to handle a given number of guerrilla fighters demonstrates the elusiveness of the guerrilla. For these reasons, I continue to affirm.
Everyone ready? Okay. Are any means of violence just as a response to political oppression?
Right, so I think violence is a just option for a few reasons. First of all, because the oppressed are guaranteed this innate right to self-defense, which allows them to push back against their oppressors.
I'm asking you more specifically, what type of violence is allowed?
Right, so I think there are lots of types of violence that are allowed, but I think the most effective means would probably be guerrilla warfare, because guerrilla warfare allows you to overcome the power disparity between a really oppressive government and a pretty weak people.
Okay, guerrilla groups often use things like sexual coercion and rape, innocent children or civilians being killed. Do you advocate for those types of violence too?
No, there's a very big distinction between terrorism and guerrilla warfare. Terrorism is when the groups specifically target innocent civilians. Guerrilla warfare is what happened in the American Revolution, when you specifically target government troops.
Okay, can you tell me an example of a violent revolution recently that has only targeted the government and not harmed innocent civilians?
Violent revolutions? I think there are lots of examples. I think we can look at freedom fighters in Syria, for instance, in specific cases, not ISIS. I'm of course not talking about ISIS, but I'm talking about like the Free Syrian Army, where they're able to actually effectively counter Assad and protect innocent people.
All right, but in that case, didn't these actions lead to a major state of chaos with almost hundreds of thousands of citizens dying in that country?
I think that's the fault of the government. I think the actual rebels are being very effective at actually countering Assad and at actually protecting innocent civilians. And I think we can look to more historic examples too, going back to the example of the American Revolution, where the United States military, which was one of the weakest on the planet, was able to overcome the British military, which had the strongest naval force, which had the strongest land force, in a decisive victory. And that really attests to the power of guerrilla warfare.
Okay.
It's able to overcome these oppressive regimes.
You specifically cite that we're able to overcome oppression. Do you have an example of a government that's formed recently from violent revolution that doesn't perpetuate more oppression?
Right, so I think there are a couple problems with your analysis. First of all, we can never definitively say that one variable will cause a more oppressive government or a less oppressive government. In fact, Prworski 12, a meta-study conducted from Duke University, concluded that in the body of available political science, in the body of available statistics, it's impossible to come to a definitive statistical conclusion that one variable will lead to a better government.
But that's not my question. I'm asking you for an example of a violent revolution that didn't perpetuate oppression.
Right, I can give you better than examples. I can provide you with an empirical study of past historical examples, which says that nonviolence does contribute to
Do you have any of those examples available?
I mean, I can provide you with the empirical study.
Okay, that's fine. If revolutions lead to government that don't actually reflect the oppressed, is that a successful one?
I think insofar as it's gotten rid of the existing structural oppression, yes. We should worry about overthrowing the government first, then worry about creating a new government.
Okay, thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank a couple of people who have made this activity possible for me. First, thank you to everyone who's involved with hosting this tournament. It's really been amazing. Thank you to my district administration team, Dr. Adams, my principal, Mr. Money, the fine arts director, and Dr. Tucker, the superintendent. I'm so lucky to be a member of a school district that really values this activity because they recognize the way that it can change lives. I want to thank my teammates here, Kelsey, Richard, Noah, Catherine, Ashley, Abby, Olivia, Jake, Maggie, Lucas, Daisy, Zach, Regan, Lane, and Jonathan for making this an amazing trip. Also, thank you to my former partners, Addison and TJ, for always dealing with this. And I want to thank my coaches, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Turpin, Mrs. Flood, Stephanie, and Mr. Josh Baldwin. Additionally, thank you to all the coaches and competitors in the Kansas City and Springfield area who create such a rich competitive environment that is Missouri debate. A special thank you to Mr. Jewel, Elizabeth, all the other coaches and competitors that came and helped me prepare for this tournament. Thank you to my dad for teaching me the value and importance of hard work. Thank you to my mom for balancing out my dad's very competitive nature and always being a supportive force in my life. Thank you, Emily and Sam, for being amazing siblings, and thank you, Emily, for being here along the ride with me. Natalie, thank you for being the best role model in debate and life. I was grateful to be your teammate, but I'm even more grateful to have you as my coach. Mr. Baldwin, I can't even get close to thanking you enough for the countless hours that you have spent making me the competitor, teammate, and person that I am today. You've taught me to not worry about my success, but do things right in life, and that success will follow those choices. Thanks to the NSDA and all of you for creating a community where everyone can find their home exchanging ideas. I'm so excited to see the changes that this community is making and how inclusive it's getting to be. So next we'll begin on the negative constructive. Everyone good? Okay. We don't value a right if it erodes the rights of all others. I negate the resolution resolved. Violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. I value justice, defined by Cambridge as the condition of being morally correct or fair. My value criterion is maximizing human rights. Respecting human rights is key to achieving justice. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights argues that recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all is the foundation of justice. These rights include safety, preservation of self and life. Observation 1. 16th and 17th century philosophy is ill-equipped to prescribe justice of violent revolution because it isn't shaped by risks, means of violence, or outcomes that a modern-day revolution requires. Buchanan in 17 argues a theory of just revolutionary war must be shaped by empirical considerations, yet many philosophers who have had something to say about just revolutionary war have not understood the importance of empirical assumptions about the risks. The implication on today's debate is that revolutions that arise from the colonial era or predate modern weaponry with the capability to eliminate entire oppressed populations fail to account for the unique circumstances of modern warfare. Griffin in 16 describes, "No longer can rebels meet their masters on equal footing. Governments now possess weapons of such destructive force which are so technically above the skills of common citizens that revolutions can no longer be successful based on a test of military power. A surveillance state with guns, tanks, drones, and chemical weapons is capable of suppressing dissidents without even threatening their own security." Contention 1. Violent revolution allows illegitimate leaders to consolidate power. Revolution removes government and political organizations, creating chaos. Fairbanks in 07 describes a post-revolutionary state to be a political world without form and void. Revolutions are a fragile basis for government. After extremist politics emerge, revolutionaries withdraw from the political scene. Leaders become desperate because they know they don't have any support. In the end, rulers discover their self-interest. Coercion culminates into the emergence of a dictator. Revolutionary chaos doesn't form into legitimate or rights-respecting government. It creates violent, consolidated rule. What's more, the use of violence in a revolution discourages democratic freedom. Finlay in 09 explains violent means could only give rise to violent ends. If revolution aims at the establishment of a sphere of democratic freedom liberated from the coercive structures of oppression, it must make a decisive break with coercion from the beginning. Violent revolution creates leaders who use violence to maintain their power. Kim in 2016 proves revolutionary leaders built in the course of revolutionary struggles perpetuate mass killing. This study uses data to demonstrate that revolutionary leaders are more likely to initiate genocide or politicide. Revolutionary leaders are more likely to commit mass violence. This effect is historically backed. Caddison in 97 argues that in Iran, their numerous revolts and revolutions were led against an unjust, arbitrary ruler to replace it with a just one. The result was generalized chaos until a new arbitrary rule was established. Following Libya's revolution, competing rival governments were no longer interested in representing the rights of the people, but rather in competing for power. Contention 2. Avoiding violent revolution maximizes human rights. Because violent revolution fails and causes the absolute destruction of human rights, there are two just choices the oppressed can use. First, they can use nonviolent revolution or protest. Carnes in 18 finds that nonviolent uprisings are almost 3 times less likely than violent ones to encounter mass killings. This is because violent revolutions threaten leaders and security forces alike, encouraging them to hold on to power at all costs, even ordering or carrying out a mass atrocity to survive. Second, they can escape their oppression. The right to exit functions as a check on political oppression. Koinova in 2009 explains diasporas unseat authoritarian regimes, and Leonard in 15 finds that when states behave oppressively towards their citizens, the right to exit offers a safety valve by providing citizens with an avenue to escape that oppression. With this in mind, we look to my opponent's case. On his value of justice and value criterion of minimizing structural oppression, he has set a burden for himself that he must fulfill, that he can show to you that violent revolution will decrease structural oppression in any way, shape, or form. In the cross-examination, I asked him for an example of where this has ever happened in the last 50 years under modern warfare, and he could not provide me an example. He has the burden to prove to you that he actually solves for his value criterion, or we never achieve justice. There's two reasons that this is flawed. First, violent revolutions do not create oppressive leaders or regimes. That's what my Kim study articulates to you. It leads to revolutionary leaders who have used violence to get power and then use violence to maintain that power again, never giving the oppressed any political leverage. And second of all, he has to tell you at what cost we value this right. How much violence, how many innocents dead, how much coercion are we allowed to use before we finally achieve our end goal? On his first contention, he says that we retain the right to harm our oppressors. He cannot draw to you the line or give you an example of a violent revolution that has only hurt the oppressor and not hurt anyone else in that country. I argue the effects of violent revolution is painful and damaging to all. He even cites to you Locke, but there's two problems with that. First, Buchanan on my framework articulates that Locke sidesteps the means and doesn't address what sort of violence would be used to achieve this ends. But secondarily, minority groups that are used in violent revolutionary groups do not reflect the oppressed. We're talking about rebel revolutionary groups, not the people who are actually being oppressed. Second, he articulates that alternatives fail. Yet in the study that he reads, the same author cites that actually violent revolutions are 3 times more likely to encounter mass killings, meaning the government feels more comfortable using their tools to suppress those sorts of dissidents. Then he also articulates that we're actually going to only be seeing cosmetic changes, and that somehow violent revolution will create some bigger or some solution for the problem he's articulating to you. But I argue that violent revolution incites violent crackdowns from the oppressor. If anything, Carnes cites that violent revolution not only brings on 3 times more mass killings, but that's because when violent revolutionaries pick up arms, it threatens the status of the regime, and they're more willing to use any means necessary to maintain power. That's especially concerning when you extend my Griffin card, who articulates that these governments are willing to use mass amounts of violence, killing hundreds of thousands of people. So either their rebellion is violently squashed, guaranteeing failure, or the loss of life is scaled up because now everyone's using bigger guns. I have 2 examples of this happening. In South Sudan, when the government heard of violent revolution, they wiped out tens of thousands of people in innocent villages as their crackdown who had never even heard of that violent revolution. That's Mendik in 2018. In Syria, violent revolution was met with a brutal tyrant, barrel bombing cities of millions of people and gassing innocent children, women, and people who lived in the wrong place. These sorts of violent acts is what revolutionaries bring on. But even then, he argues that violence is effective in putting in place a respectful regime. But I argue that it's only justifying endless violence. Violent revolution creates an endless cycle of violence by justifying morally abhorrent actions. If anything, revolutionary leaders take power again and use violence in their rule. Those sorts of things could never be just.
All right, is everyone ready? Mm-hmm. Let's begin. So let's start on your contention 1 about how violent revolution allows illegitimate leaders in, right?
Yes.
So you talk about how violent means lead to violent ends, right?
Correct.
And then you bring up this Perkowski 18 study, right?
No, I read to you a study from Kim.
I'm talking about the study that says that there's 3 times more likely to be mass killings.
That's from Carnes and Chenoweth.
That's Carnes and Chenoweth.
Yes.
Okay. Where did the sample size from that study come from?
It came from a large amount of selections of both violent and non-violent revolutions.
Okay. What was in the sample? How did they determine what was included?
They basically just chose whether or not they had enough information and then chose and selected violent and nonviolent revolutions. And in those cases, under the study or the specific citation I write, it talks about whether or not a country was willing to use a mass killing against that revolution.
Okay, gotcha. So in your worlds, can the oppressed seek any recourse?
Yes, I argue they can seek recourse through nonviolent means, but if that fails, it's preferable to leave the country than fight, because fighting will not only risk your life, but the rest of the lives in your country.
So let's talk about nonviolence. Have you provided any holistic statistics to prove that nonviolence works?
Right, I'm not saying that nonviolence will always work. I also say that violence will not always work. If anything, violence receives more violent responses and doesn't solve for oppression.
But can you
I'm saying, yes.
But can you provide any holistic statistics statistics to prove that nonviolence will work.
Well, the statistics I read to you in my second contention says that it's less likely to encounter mass killings. I'm
Right,
not
but
saying.
does it overthrow the governments?
I'm not specifically saying that it's more successful at that. I'm saying the thing that's most successful is actually fleeing your country and using your power as a diaspora, as a refugee, to make change.
So how is an oppressed person supposed to flee their country? How is someone stuck in North Korea supposed to flee their country when the government is shooting them at the border?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thought experiment. You cite to me it's hard for people to leave from North Korea. I argue it's easier for them to leave than to find military weapons, train themselves and their friends to overthrow that government and not cause mass chaos in the country.
Okay, so what happened when what happened when refugees fled Syria?
Right, so not only have we gained way more international attention, but even then, international groups have started to reflect and notice that issue.
But when refugees left Syria, weren't they forced to go into refugee camps? Weren't they faced with white nationalism in Europe? Weren't they faced with a ton of backlash that ended up continuing their cycle of oppression?
Yes, but I articulate that their outcome is better than those who died in Syria after the violent revolution when their government unleashed chemical weapons onto innocent civilians, all due to the revolution.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of innocent deaths. Are innocent deaths justified in the long term if they can actually stop political oppression?
You have yet to give me an example of where innocent deaths have led to outcomes.
Let's talk about hypothetical.
Even if you could provide that to me, I would argue that using 400,000 innocent lives as a bartering chip is never something just.
Let's talk about a hypothetical. If we can kill some innocent people in the short term to create a less oppressive government, to create a democratic government that doesn't oppress the people, is that justified?
Again, I don't think you can prove that to me, but if you could prove that it was minimal death, then yes.
Okay, thank you. It's not on. Oh, there. I will be rebutting the negative case, then defending the affirmative case. Is everyone ready? and let's begin. The key difference between an affirmative ballot and a negative ballot is that a negative ballot is a vote for no change in the status quo. It's a vote for the oppressed to continue becoming oppressed. The affirmative vote is a vote for change. With that, let's move on to my opponent's framework. Let's start on the criterion of maximizing human rights. 2 problems. First, you can't have a society that maximizes human rights if it structurally oppresses a group of people. We need to have all interests represented in the government. We need to minimize structural oppression first. Second of all, I outweigh under her framework. Remember that in her world, the oppressed don't have access to this powerful tool of violence, which means that oppression continues indefinitely. In her world, all the rights violations caused by oppressive governments continue indefinitely. That definitely outweighs the small rights violations caused by the deaths of innocent civilians in my world. With that, let's move on to the contention 1. First, she talks about how violent revolution just leads to chaos and how it doesn't lead to democracy. 2 problems. First, Prworski 12, a meta-study conducted by Duke University, found that it's impossible to say that one variable, like violent revolution, will definitively lead to an undemocratic regime in the future. That looks at the whole body of statistics, not just one statistic like my opponent cites. But second of all, even if we can't predict whether violent revolution will lead to a better government, remember that historically there is precedent to support that violent revolutions will lead to democracy. Heger 2012 finds that the political factors created by violent revolution actually do contribute or actually have contributed in the past to violent revolutions. Now let's move on to her second point under this contention, that violent means result in violent ends. That may sound good, but it's not empirically true. Klopp 2007, a study, found an inverted U relationship between violence and democratization. So what that means is that in the short term, violence may cause instability. It may cause suffering. But in the long term, it creates less violence. It creates less instability. And I would say creating a less oppressive government is definitely worth that short-term suffering. On to the contention 2. She cannot provide you with a single holistic statistic to prove that nonviolence actually works at overthrowing the government. Furthermore, she cold concedes that actually nonviolence would never work without the threat of violence. On the second justification, about how people can just run away, well, when they run away, they go to places like Europe, where they face more oppression, where they face white nationalism. With that, let's move on to the affirmative case. On the framework, my opponent says that I must show how it will decrease structural oppression. I'm saying that we can't predict what the new government will look like, but we should focus first and foremost on getting rid of existing oppression. Now, let's move on to the contention 1 about self-defense. My opponent just makes a ton of responses, but remember, even if you don't buy self-defense, violent revolution is still justified because it mitigates structural oppression. On to the contention 2, where she makes a lot of really key concessions. First of all, she concedes Chenoweth 17, which tells you that nonviolence isn't going to work in the future. That tells you that the only route to freedom for the oppressed is violence. The only change in the status quo will result from an affirmative ballot. She also concedes my 4th warrant about the threat of violence. Remember what that tells you. Any instance my opponent can provide you about how nonviolence has worked was only because there were violent factions in that movement. We can only create change with violence. On my contention 3 about how violent revolution is effective, she again reiterates that it'll end up with more violence. It'll end up in more oppressive governments. She hasn't shown that empirically, and it's impossible to. Furthermore, she concedes all my justifications. Perhaps the most important justification is guerrilla warfare. Remember, when the government is really, really powerful, the only route to escape the oppression of the government is through guerrilla warfare. The only way to overcome that disparity is by using guerrilla warfare.
All right, is everyone ready? We will be going negative and then affirmative. You would never prefer a world where we violate all rights of others when we say we're doing it for something good. My opponent has the burden to prove to you that not only are we having violent revolution with the intention of overcoming oppression, but that we will legitimately overcome oppression when we throw these nations into chaos. On my value of justice and value criterion of maximizing human rights, my opponent says we only maximize human rights if we don't have structural oppression. But that's the point of my case. When we have violent revolution, we perpetuate structural oppression forever. We never solve for that problem because the people coming in power used structural means of violence to gain and maintain that power and will continue to use it in their rule. That doesn't overcome any of these structures that he's claiming to overcome. Even then, he says you ought to weigh the idea that people have a right to violence and that they don't have any other option. Yet then he concedes all of my cards that I read to you at the bottom of my second contention from Koinova that says diasporas and groups of refugees are able to unseat authoritarian regimes without ever picking up a gun. On my first contention, I argue that violent revolution creates illegitimate leaders. He makes two very interesting and contradictory attacks. He first articulates it's impossible for us to use studies to determine whether or not there will be democracy. Yet then his third attack is that there's actually a study that says that violence doesn't lead to democratization. Force him to choose one of those. Either we're allowed to use statistics to predict democratization or we're not. Don't let him use both of those attacks on the same contention. But even then, he says there are historical examples of where we've overcome oppression and led to rights-respecting governments. Make him name those examples. I've read to you 6 to 8 examples of where in South Sudan, Syria, Libya, Iran, all of these countries where we've led to perpetual unfettered oppression, and he can't name to you one where we haven't had that outcome. Even then, that's your first voting issue in today's debate, is that the outcomes of revolution are not overcoming structural oppression, they're perpetuating it more. Kim in 16 cites that revolutionary leaders are more likely to commit genocide and politicide. They're more likely to use their power and continue it on when they're in rulership, and that doesn't overthrow oppression. On my second contention, I argue that avoiding violent revolution maximizes human rights. He never answers the warrant of my Carnes card that cites that violent revolutionaries actually bring on and incite 3 times more mass killings from their government than nonviolent ones do. That's because a government, when threatened by their rule, is willing to wipe out entire innocent villages like they did in South Sudan. Those sorts of levels of crackdown don't happen with nonviolent protests as commonly, and that's why you prefer it. But even then, he attacks my right to flee point by saying that it's not okay for us to put the burden on people to flee their country. That's simply not right. I articulate to you that A, the burden of fighting a violent revolution, putting your life at risk and hundreds of thousands of people in your nation, is much higher than the burden or risk of fleeing your country. If anything, fleeing your country is things that also happens after a violent revolution, as he's pointed out to you. You prefer my evidence because Koinova cites that diasporas give them political leverage they didn't have before that allows them to flee their country and create change. That's more than what actually happens when a revolutionary rebel group consolidates power, doesn't listen to the rights of the oppressed, and puts in place another oppressive regime. On to his case. On his value of justice and value criterion of minimizing structural oppression, I made 2 attacks that he didn't really answer. First, I argue that violent revolutions only create new, more oppressive regimes. He doesn't answer that point. He says we can't predict the outcomes, yet I've given you the prediction. Every single time we've had a violent revolution in the last 50 years, it has led to a state of anarchy and chaos, and then another violent leadership, potentially even terrorist group, isolating their power to perpetuate those problems more. But the second answer that I made was he has to show to you at what cost are we willing to have this cause? I articulate to you that revolutionaries in South Sudan use things like sexual coercion and rape, child slaves, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Are those means justified if we say it's simply overcoming structural oppression? That's your second voting issue in today's debate, is that my opponent's conception of justice says that overcoming oppression has no moral fundamental rules. We can just do anything we want as long as we're hopefully overcoming oppression. Pair that with the fact that he can't prove to you that we'll overcome oppression, and you've got a dangerous level or conception of justice that I'm not willing to accept. Even then, on his first contention, he says that people retain the right to hurt others. He drops all 3 answers I make on this contention. First, I say that he can't contain violence against just the oppressor. The right to self-defense says it's okay to kill your oppressor. It doesn't say it's okay to destroy your nation and kill hundreds of thousands of people in that country. I additionally cite that Buchanan argues that Locke not only sidesteps the means, allowing any violent justification to happen, but also, and most importantly, I articulate to you that violent revolution revolutions are led by minority rebel groups, not by the oppressed. Those people are more likely to put in place structural oppression and perpetuate violence. You're never solving for these issues if you say that violence solves the problem. That's what Finlay in 09 in my case articulates. If you want to break the structures of this oppression, you have to make a break with coercion at the beginning. Using coercion to end a coercion only leads to a cycle of violence. Additionally, on his second contention, he says all alternatives fail and that I never answer his Chenoweth card. But I proved to you that Chenoweth specifically cites that nonviolence is less likely to encounter mass killings. But even then, he doesn't give you examples of a successful violent revolution, something that you infinitely support. Then he also doesn't answer either of my two main attacks on his second and third contention. I argue that we see issues of crackdown, where governments are willing to go into innocent villages, kill more people, and commit more oppression when we start violence. He has the burden to prove to you that that's just, but additionally has the burden to prove to you that endless violence by the revolutionaries is okay. That's your third and final voting issue. My opponent will say in his next speech that guerrilla warfare is good or that it will solve for all of these problems, but I articulate to you that that's what leads to more violent consolidated rule, more oppression. If anything, you prefer my evidence about diaspora, that proves to you we've been able to unseat authoritarian regimes. But even then, if you don't buy that, it doesn't throw your state into endless chaos and sheer anarchy. Thank you.
I will be going over framework, then key voting issues. Is everyone ready? And let's begin. On the framework, we essentially agree on the principle we should try to do what protects the oppressed and what creates a change for the better of the status quo. So with that, let's move on to key voting issues. My first key voting issue is that nonviolence is not an effective tool. She tries to say that in the negative world, we can have it all. We can prevent innocent deaths, and we can create revolution. But that is not what the negative world is. In the negative world, nonviolence does not create any change, for a couple reasons. First of all, she can't provide you with any statistics of nonviolence actually working. Second of all, I provide you with the warrants that nonviolence won't work in the future because regimes are becoming savvier at dealing with the techniques of these nonviolent protests. That's a point she concedes. I also provide you with Chenoweth 2017, which empirically tells you that nonviolent revolutions are not working anymore. She responds by just saying that, well, Chenoweth says that mass killings increase when we choose violence. But that's non-responsive to my Chenoweth card. Remember, nonviolence will not let the oppressed escape their oppressors. Let's move on to the second key voting issue, and that's that violent revolution works. It first works in the sense that it overthrows governments. Remember my conceded point about guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare allows the people to overthrow governments that are significantly more powerful than them. Now, my opponent got up in her last speech, and she came and said that, well, at what cost? At what cost are we overthrowing these governments? We're killing innocent people. But remember the weighing analysis I provide you that she concedes. When we choose violence, we get rid of at least the status quo oppression. We create a chance for a better government. When we negate, we don't give any chance for the oppressed. The current oppression, the current rights violations continue indefinitely. That's the most important analysis of this debate. If she wants to talk about rights, then let's consider that rights violations continue indefinitely in her world. At least in my world, we can try to change the world for the better. Now, she also says that violence leads to more violence, but she concedes the actual holistic evidence I provide, CLOP 2007, which tells you that in the long term, violence decreases as a result of violent revolution. That's really important because that tells you that in the long term, violent revolution does create better governments, or it does actually create better societies that don't have as many innocent people dying. Remember, the round is going to go down like this. If we want to value rights, if we care about the oppressed, if we want to get rid of oppression, we have to affirm. In the negative world, the oppressed have no recourse. They cannot get rid of the governments. A vote for the negative is a vote for a hopeless world. A vote for the affirmative is a vote for a chance at change. For those reasons, I affirm. Good round. Thanks, good round.
At this time, please welcome the 7th through 14th place winners in Lincoln Douglas debate, presented by Illinois College, to the stage. Congratulating today's semifinalists and finalists will be board member Byron Arthur. In 14th place, Blake Ochoa from Lake Travis High School in Texas, coached by Mackenzie Marquez. In 13th place, Raymond Fang from Monte Vista in California, coached by David Matley. In 12th place, Navia Krishnan from Hamilton High School in Arizona, coached by Gina Mead. In 11th place, Nick Samila from William Tennant High School in Pennsylvania, coached by Christopher Burdick, Colleen Mooney, Tim Coughlin, and Sheila Lubert. In 10th place, Katie Raffleson from Brentwood School in California, coached by Victor G. and Katie Totes. In 9th place, Arnav Hurray from Stony Point High School in Texas, coached by Richard Cooling. In 8th place, Selena Zhang from Lake Oswego Senior High School in Oregon, coached by Robin Rose, Jason Miller, and Mickey Parsons. And in 7th place, Mihir Rai from Green Hill in Texas, coached by Aaron Timmons and DeMarcus Powell. Any student who places in the top 14 in the main event at this year's tournament is automatically invited back to participate in that same event at the 2020 National Tournament. Would any of you who have just completed the 9th, 10th, or 11th grade please take a step forward? Ladies and gentlemen, automatic qualifiers for next year's National Tournament in Lincoln Douglas Debate. Let's welcome the finalists in Lincoln Douglas Debate to the stage for their introduction. On the affirmative, you had Nehal Chigurupati from University School in Ohio, coached by James Lewis, Peter Pack, and Matt Sleskak. And representing the negative, Grace Johannes from Liberty Senior High School in Missouri, coached by Tim Baldwin. Are either or both of you non-seniors? I'm sorry, what? He's coming back! Congratulations on auto qualification to next year's national tournament. At this point, would the judges for the public forum round please make their way to the table in front?